All right, so we're looking at day 2 here. This is gonna finish up chapter 2 in your regular NASM textbook. So you know, you want to use your regular NASM for most of this class. We're just doing a big review basically of all of the basics of anatomy, right? We're getting a lot of the basics anatomy, basics of physiology down. And that way, like, we'll be able to have that as a foundation to talk about when we dive in deeper, talking about like what it is we're assessing for. Like, we're assessing somebody's, physiologic and anatomic like capabilities, right? Their structure and their capabilities. So as we're looking at this, yesterday we went over the nervous system, which is like our command center, our control center, right? We went over like the structure that we have, which is our skeletal system, acting as like the levers in order for us to be able to do all of our daily movements. But now we're going ahead and looking at the muscular system, which is really responsible for most of the movement. And then we also have our endocrine system here. I'm going to talk about it and go through like just as a lesson. But endocrine stuff, like hormone stuff, that's again something that we're not necessarily like testing for. It's not something we are really assessing. And so I'll go over it and mention it, but it won't be like a really in-depth like lesson with your notes. So we just because like that's probably, there's not going to be too many questions related to that in your homework. So note wise, we can talk about it, and if you want me to go over anything, we certainly can, but we don't necessarily have to like dive super far into the note taking when it comes to hormones in this course at least. So obviously, again, our purpose for this lecture, similar to yesterday's, we are going to talk about the definition, structure, and function of our human movement system, right? We're primarily talking about the kinetic chain here. And by understanding those structures, we'll be able to understand like how they operate. So we're going to kind of finish off the kinetic chain. Oh, hold on. I forgot it's a NASM 6th edition PowerPoint. Let me fix these slides again really quick. I meant to do this before and I forgot. Transition, no animations, animations pane, and deleting all animations. Sorry. But it's a lot better than dealing with the nonsense. Oh my God, I can do multiple slides at once. I did not know I could do that. Shift, delete, did that work? No. I can highlight multiple, but it doesn't do anything. Okay. Yeah, sure enough, fine. All right, got him. Okay, back to what we were talking about. So, all right, so our objectives for today are to understand the muscular system and the endocrine system and how they respond and adapt to exercise. Looking at our muscular system, kind of picking out from yesterday, the muscular system is going to be a series of muscles that are under the control of the nervous system and are designed to generate internal tension in order to manipulate the skeletal system. So your muscular system, if we look at like each of your individual like cells in your muscular system, we call those muscle fibers, muscle cells. If we look at each of those individual muscle fibers, what we're going to see is that they have these specialized little proteins in them that are really good at gripping onto each other and like moving, right? And so that causes like a muscle cell to go from being this long to being this long, right? And then it can relax back to this long. And so they're really good at like shortening. And that's one thing we got to remember about muscles. Muscles can only pull. That's the only thing they can do. They can only pull, and then they can relax back to their original length. But muscles cannot push. So, understanding that gives us a pretty good understanding of like why we have agonists and antagonists, right? If a muscle can only pull, well, then I would like end up like moving into this posture and I'd be stuck like that for the rest of my life. But luckily I'm not, because I have an opposite muscle that can pull in the other direction, right? And then my muscles can relax, right? They can pull and they can relax. That's about all that your muscles can really do. As we're looking at it, right, the big thing we got to remember is that like an actual muscle is like a bundle of a bundle of a bundle of a bundle of a bundle. It's just a whole bunch of bundles all tied together. So if we look at like muscle bundles, see if I can get a good picture here. Yeah, there we go. This is great. So if you look here, you can see there's an individual muscle fiber, right? So this right here is an actual muscle cell, and it's wrapped up with a whole bunch of other muscle cells that you can see, and then they're all wrapped up in together, and we call that a fascicle, right? A fascicle is basically a bundle of muscle fibers, and then you have a whole bunch of fascicles that are all bound together and wrapped in a big sheet. That's what makes up your overall like muscle belly, right? So it's a bundle of muscle fibers all bundled together to make up your overall muscle belly, right? So it's a compilation of many individual fibers wrapped together in certain connective tissues. So the first bundle is the muscle itself. I kind of dislike the way they do this. Nesm always goes from like outside in, and I always think it's better to go like inside out. But the first bundle, meaning the outermost bundle, like the actual thing that you see the most of, is the muscle itself, right? So bundling, we'll label this as muscle bundling, right? So the outer layer, it's going to go like muscle is a bundle of fascicles, which I always spell wrong because some people pronounce it fascicles. Actually, you know what? Let's do that. So a muscle is a bundle of fascicles, right? And then we'll put that in bold. There we go. Then we have a fascicle, which is a bundle of individual muscle fibers, right? So, and then like a muscle fiber, and we can go even a little bit deeper here, or muscle cell is a series of actin and myosin proteins, right? So, so if you look at it, right, you've got your overall muscle, which is a whole bunch of fascicles bound together. And what a fascicle is that's a whole bunch of muscle cells bound together. And what a muscle cell has inside of it are a whole bunch of specialized proteins called actin and myosin, right? And so all of those are wrapped in each of their own like little sheets, right? There's a little layer of connective tissue on the outside of all of those. So, you know, just like a cell wall has to be around the outside of your cell, that's what keeps all of your structures intact, right? It's like the perimeter of your city, right? And so like that muscle fiber has its little wall on the outside. That's the innermost outer wall, like for the layer. So that's the innermost layer. We call that an endomysium, right? Endo for being like inside. Now the next layer you're gonna see, and you can see that right here, that kind of like the white line surrounding the outside of the muscle fiber. Now in a fascicle, that's your middle layer, right? That is around the outside of all of the muscle fibers. That's what's like holding those together, right? So that layer, that's going to be called your paramecium, right? It's around the perimeter of your fascicle, right? So a fascicle is held together with your paramecium. And then you have got the outermost layer, like the uppermost layer, right? This would almost be like your ozone layer, right? Like this is a way letter, and that's going to be called your epimecium, right? Your epimecium is sometimes referred to as like fascia, right? It's the outermost layer that kind of holds everything together. So when we think of like what fascia is, right? If we look at fascia here, it's this, you can see right? That's your thoracolumbar fascia. It's this like outermost layer of kind of thick connective tissue that holds your muscles in the arrangement that they're supposed to be held in. And that's great because that keeps your muscles from moving in too many like awkward directions. You know, like these are a bunch of bundles. We want those bundles to stay wrapped rather than being able to like, you know, go in some type of random direction, maybe get caught on something. We don't want that to happen, right? And so we have this kind of outer fascia connective tissue that kind of holds the whole thing together. And that's really great. But the problem with fascia is that it tends to have limited blood flow. It tends to get really tight really easily. That's why we get things like IT band syndrome, right? That's basically like a tightening of the fascia in the IT band. Those are kind of our layers, and those are kind of the things that are holding them together. Does anybody have any questions on the layering stuff? I know the layering stuff can sometimes be kind of a pain. Everybody pretty good on that?
Yes, sir.
All right.
Yes, sir.
Cool, cool, cool. All right, so then we're moving into talking about connective tissue, right? So that's what your muscle is. And then let's go ahead and look at connective tissue here, which really like fascia counts as a connective tissue. But basically, you are going to have tendons, right? Tendons, so yesterday we talked about ligaments, right? Ligaments are there to hold our bones to other bones. They're pretty similar. They're pretty similar to tendons, at least in terms of like how they function and stuff. You know, like they're not actually similar in the sense of like what they, you know, what they hold together, but they are similar in terms of like they both get limited blood flow, they both repair really slowly, and they're both often like what we are trying to avoid when it comes to injuries. Like when you hear about somebody pulling a muscle, yeah, like that can happen in the belly of the muscle. Like you can pull a muscle like anywhere throughout the belly of the muscle, but you know, like the belly of the muscle is the stuff that's like really flexible, you know, like it's the stuff that's made to contract and expand or relax, right? But your tendons, because they are much stiffer, they tend to be like really the root cause of a lot of our muscle pulls and muscle tears and things like that, because they're the stuff that doesn't relax, right? They're the stuff that's like kind of holding on really stiff. So if that happens, you know, you're going to have like continuing problems, right? So if you have a history of hamstring pulls, it's probably because, you know, you created some type of like damage in the muscle. And then over time, it developed like scar tissue. And now that fiber is not as flexible as it used to be. So your tendons, the main thing they are like by definition, is that they are connective tissue that attaches muscles to bones, right? So your muscles are going to end in a tendon, right? And you can see like we kind of draw that in white here because like it again gets less blood flow, so it's not as saturated with like red blood cells. So it's going to kind of come down and end by inserting into a bone, right? So their main job here, and you can see we got a little sub note here, they provide the anchor from which muscles can exert force to manipulate the bones, right? So like this is actually where your muscles are attaching. Things we need to remember about them, again, they have poor blood flow, and therefore they repair much more slowly. So they are much, you know, slower to adapt, much slower to repair. All right, so let's go ahead and move into talking about like muscle cells, right? So if we look at like, you know, we've kind of talked about the big, let's zoom in like crazy and get into the small, right? So if we're looking at this and we're looking at like, again, a muscle fiber, right? That is going to be defined as like an individual muscle cell, right? So it's got all the normal properties that a cell is going to have, right? Remember, your cells, if we look at like a classic animal cell, it's got a Golgi apparatus, and it's got like an endoplasmic reticulum and lysosomes and mitochondria, nucleus, like all that normal stuff. It does have all that normal stuff. But again, kind of like we talked about when we were talking about cells yesterday, you know, no animal cell really just looks like what we saw. Like the closest you're gonna get to a cell that actually looks like this in your body, like this is just like such a basic cell that doesn't really have any outer characteristics. Therefore, it can't really do anything. It can live, right? Like it's got all of its own stuff to kind of be alive, but it doesn't really have any like special structures to like do anything. You know, it would just kind of quiver and, you know, shake around. So we got to have kind of a specialized like structure, right? Like neurons have this really cool, you know, structure that allows them to kind of grip onto things. If you look at like bone cells, right? If you take a look at those, you're going to see a lot of like the classic structures, right? But they're also going to have like osteoclasts and osteoblasts, which, you know, have this ability to kind of eat things and, you know, spit up things. And so that, you know, attracts calcium ions. And then if you look at like muscle cells, right? Or muscle fibers, like with what we actually like to call them, you're going to see all the normal structures in there, right? You're going to see, hold on, I'm trying to find a picture that I want to find. Let's try this. Muscle fiber with organelles. That's not bad. So you're gonna see kind of a specialized version of what we normally see in a cell. Oh, there we go. Put them side by side. All right, so like you can see like mitochondria, right, running throughout like the muscle fiber, just like we normally have, right? It does still have like all the normal cell structures. It's gonna have nuclei, right? You're gonna see little nucleuses running throughout here, right? But you're also gonna see this kind of webbing that surrounds it, right? So this is like what we call the endoplasmic reticulum, right? And that is like this kind of really cool little wall here near your nucleus, and like its job is to kind of like assemble these little protein builders, right? We call ribosomes. So they're there to kind of like assemble all that stuff, right? But if you look at a muscle cell here, we have kind of a specialized version of this, right? Like if you look at your endoplasmic reticulum, right? You know, it's there near like the nucleus, right? And again, you got two versions. You got a rough endoplasmic reticulum and a smooth endoplasmic reticulum. And you can see the rough stuff, see all those little bumps? Those are like little ribosomes, right? They're there to like assemble those things. That's how your nucleus of your cell communicates with like the rest of the cell, right? It's where all your DNA is being assembled. The nucleus has the DNA, the ribosomes assemble that DNA. So that's what we're seeing in there. But in a muscle cell, it's this webbing. So it looks very, very different, and it has to look very different because it has a very different like structure here. So because it's different, we give it a special name. Rather than calling it endoplasmic, we're gonna call it the sarcoplasmic reticulum, okay? So sarco comes from the word like, I believe, flesh. And so like whenever you hear the word sarco before a word, like if you hear sarco something, you're probably in muscle territory. You're probably talking about muscles. Just like if you ever hear the word like myo, right? That's also related to muscles, like muscle, myo, flesh, sarco. So sarcoplasmic reticulum is this webbing around the outside there. And that allows it to do this really cool thing where it can actually flush calcium and other materials throughout the belly of the muscle. And that way, like, you can have this electrochemical gradient that travels throughout your entire muscle cell. And it's like, okay, well, that's all great. Like, why do I need to have electricity running through my muscle? And why do I need to have like calcium in a muscle, right? Calcium is related to bones. Why would it ever be important for like my muscular system? Well, the thing about like the electricity is that is what triggers the release of calcium, right? So electricity traveling over your entire muscle fiber is what triggers the release of the calcium. And why is calcium important? Well, calcium is actually what attracts these specialized little proteins inside of your muscle. Another special shape that your muscles have is they have those like specialized little proteins that can grab onto each other and pull, and that causes the shortening to happen. So you need a sarcoplasmic reticulum to be able to get the electricity around the entire muscle cell, and you need the calcium to be able to create the shortening. That allows muscle cells, muscle fibers, to do their specialized structures, right? So, I'm sorry, not specialized structures, specialized functions. So looking at a muscle fiber here, right? We are going to see a lot of, again, the normal stuff, right? We're going to see a cellular plasma, right? That is going to basically be like the liquid portion of your cell. Again, we're mostly water, right? So like there's going to be, again, we're going to call that sarcoplasm. I should actually put that up here. Referred to as sarcoplasm whenever in muscle cells. Actually, you know what? That deserves parentheses. So referred to as sarcoplasm in your actual muscle cells. It is a liquid. It is a, well, yeah, it's a liquid that contains materials like glycogen, fats, minerals, and things like myoglobin. So your liquid portion, right, when we look inside of a cell, that is going to be, there we go. That liquid portion is going to be just like any other liquid portion. That allows you to kind of move materials around. Like you've got to get glucose into the mitochondria, right? So like if you're going to produce any ATP, if you're going to produce energy in a cell, you got to be able to get like a molecule of sugar over to where it needs to go, right? And so like that's why you have like the fluid portion of most of our cells. Like we evolved from like a fluid-based creature, and you know, then one day like an animal cell ate a mitochondria and was like, I'm gonna keep this thing around rather than digest it. Like that's how we got our mitochondria. So then we started like using oxygen to produce energy, right? Rather than just using like the fluid portion and sugars, carbohydrates. So now in like a muscular cell, you have got all that fluid still, but you've also got lots and lots and lots of other little organelles here, like these mitochondria, right? So we are going to see those mitochondria, which are your big energy producers, right? So mitochondria, hold on. Mitochondria are going to be the energy producers for your muscle fiber, right? I hate to say it, but you know, every biology teacher said this all for you know, since the beginning of time. It is the powerhouse of your cell. Oh, yeah. The most cliche sentence that every freaking bio teacher says. But that is true. That is what the mitochondria does. For the most part, like it's there to produce energy for you, right? So that is your mitochondria. And then you get your nucleus, which is like the command center, right? Nucleus. This is sort of the command center of the muscle fiber, containing DNA and other materials for how the muscle should grow and function. So that's what your nucleus is, right? So that's all pretty normal, right? Like we're seeing all the normal stuff here. But you are going to have these specialized structures, right? And these specialized structures are going to be your myofibrils or myofibrils, right? And that's really the most important ones we should talk about, right? So myofibrils, okay? Myofibrils. And I'm going to underline this one because this one is definitely the most relevant to us, right? All that other stuff is kind of your basic biology. But this is the stuff that's like directly related to what we do. So these are specialized structures that contain a muscle fiber's myofilaments and allow the muscle to have the ability to contract or relax, right? So your myofibrils are these little areas that contain your myofilaments, right? And myofilaments is what we're going to talk about next. Myofilaments are the special proteins that I mentioned earlier, right? We have all these specialized little proteins that allow our muscle cells to shorten and lengthen. And we got to look at those and understand those. So we're going to kind of go over them in their own little section here. Let's see here, go like that. What do you not like that? Okay. Okay, so what are myofibrils? Oops. Or at least what are these myofilaments? So you are going to have, actually, sorry, not myofilaments. Man, Thursdays, I'm like, my brain's all scattered. I'm all over the place today. So your myofilaments, you're gonna have the first one, which is gonna be actin, okay? So actin is the thin filament, right? It has these special like binding sites, right? You can see it right here, right? That is your actin strand, okay? So it has binding sites for other myofilaments, like myosin, to attach to, right? So your actin is this like little thin strand. Let's go ahead and pull up a much larger picture here. Actin and myosin, right? So here's a much larger picture of what this looks like, right? You can see, actually, this is way better. You can see these little like strands here, right? This is your actin strand. And then this is your myosin strand. You see these little like club-like heads, right? They like to reach up and grab this actin strand. So like this guy is gonna reach up and grab it, and it's gonna pull it this way, right? It's gonna pull it further in this direction. This one's gonna grab here and pull that direction, right? They're gonna pull and shorten the muscle fiber. So if we look at that actually, there we go. Right, and you can see, by the way, this strand, this is your myosin strand, it's much thicker, right? So you get your thin strand, that's the actin, you get your thick strand, that's your myosin, right? So you can see like this is gonna pull this way, and this one's gonna pull this way. So they're like in a cocked position. They reach up and grab and pull it this way. Meanwhile, on the other half of the fibers, this one's reaching up and grabbing and pulling it this way. So the muscle cell is actually coming together. And they're arranged like this part of like your actin and myosin, this myofilament is going to be zigzagged compared to this one. So that creates this kind of zigzagging motion. And that's why we call this area like a Z line. So this Z line is going to move closer to this Z line because the thick myosin strand is going to pull the actin towards its center, okay? So, so that's your actin. Let's get myosin up there. Myosin, right? And myosin is the thick filament, and it has binding heads that reach up and attach to the actin, pulling the actin toward, I guess I should say, away from its Z line. Okay, and then we'll put a special little note here. When actin causes Z lines to move toward each other. There we go. So when like myosin contracts in this direction and myosin contracts in this direction, your two Z lines are going to travel like closer together. Now we're going to refer to this area of town, right? Like this, the space between these two Z lines, we're going to refer to this as the sarcomere. So I'm going to go up here and we're going to put the sarcomere. That is the area between two Z lines that contains the actin and myosin. So your sarcomere is not like a physical thing, right? Like an actin is a protein, and myosin is like a protein. But the area where those two things, I guess I don't need to put this up here. The area where those two things, that's probably messing up somebody's notes, exists is referred to as the sarcomere, right? It's the area of town where these things are at, basically. Okay, now it's back. So now there are two other specialized myofilaments. So I do got to go up and mention that here. We will put this under myofilaments. These are your regulatory proteins, right? So those are your actin and myosin, they're contractile proteins, but we don't want our muscular system to contract at all times. Like we don't want actin and myosin to always be bound to each other, and they are always, always attracted to each other. Like they constantly want to bind together, but we want to be able to relax our muscles, right? Like they want to be in this shortened position. We don't want them always in that shortened position. So we have these regulatory proteins. We have these proteins that are there to kind of block those binding sites. Those are going to be called troponin and tropomyosin. Okay, so troponin, and I'm just going to go ahead and put them together, but tropomyosin, they're technically slightly different than each other. Like, let's see, you can't really see a picture of it there, but if we look at like troponin and tropomyosin, tropomyosin is the band, and then troponin actually has the binding sites. So we'll kind of look at that here in just a second. But these are there to block, right? So they are located on the actin strand. Located on the actin strand, they are responsible for blocking myosin's ability to bind to actin. This allows muscles to relax back to full length, right? So, you know, this allows our muscles to be able to relax. In fact, you'll even see like a loss of this when you look at things like rigor mortis, right? What that is like, you know, basically the body has lost its ability to like produce ATP, which means it's lost its ability to put troponin and tropomyosin back in place. So a muscle will contract, and that's why we call a dead body a stiff. That's kind of where that term comes from, because they literally are. Like that. There we go. Okay, so two protein structures that are also really important, tropomyosin and troponin, right? Tropomyosin is located on the actin filament and it blocks the binding sites. Troponin is also on the actin myosin, and it has like little binding sites that allow for calcium. So you can think of like tropomyosin as like the strand. You can kind of see it here, right? The big strand that's actually blocking, if you see, it's kind of looks like little blueberries, right? Well, those little like darker spots are where the myosin head would reach up and grab those little binding sites in order to create like a power stroke. But luckily, you know, tropomyosin is actually here to block all those binding sites, so it can't make the muscle contract. Meanwhile, you've got troponin here, and it's attached to those little threads. And so when calcium comes in, calcium is attracted to that troponin, and that moves the strand out of the way, exposing the binding sites, and now myosin can reach up and grab actin, right? So let's go ahead. I'm going to show you a quick little video that has, we've watched this in class before, but this has a really good animation for how muscles actually contract. So we're going to watch just a little crash course video here. Is this the one I want to look at? Yeah.
Still too tired to check.
And we will mute the mattress ad. My whole life is mattress ads right now. Googled it one time. Just curious. All right.
Famous star-crossed lovers bring to mind.
Actually, really quick, can everybody hear that really well? Is that volume okay for everyone?
Yes.
Yeah, sounds
I
good.
have no idea what it
Good.
looks like on your end. All right, here we go.
And insatiable longing, forbidden love, and tragic separation, and poets and emo rockers love them for it. But you know where else you can find a nice pop romance? Your muscle cells. They've got their own famous coupling, a pretty pair of tiny protein strands called actin and myosin. Romeo and Juliet may have set a chain of tragic events into motion with their infatuation, but deep down in the cells of your muscles, the hot protein action between actin and myosin is actually literally causing all of your motions. All of them. And I don't just mean voluntary stuff like walking down the street or moving your mouth so you can talk or chew chips, because your muscles also support your weight and help fend off gravity. The amazing thing about your complicated self-healing, blood-guzzling muscle tissues is that they turn chemical potential energy into mechanical energy or movement simply by doing two things: contracting and relaxing. And that contracting and relaxing is exactly what's fueled by the constant coupling and separation of biology's greatest lovers. Somebody get these proteins a movie contract. You will recall from our early lessons on tissues that you're kept alive and moving by three types of muscle tissue: smooth, cardiac, and skeletal. Your smooth muscle tissue is found in the walls of all your hollow visceral organs like your stomach and airways and blood vessels, where it involuntarily and very usefully pushes fluid and other material around by contracting and relaxing over and over. Your heart is so important that it gets its very own muscle tissue type, cardiac muscle, which looks striped or striated and also functions involuntarily to keep your blood pumping without you having to think about it. But when you hear the word muscle, you're probably thinking of the kind that you see on Chris Evans when he first walks out of that machine in Captain America. And those types, the ones you can see and feel and flex, are your 640 skeletal muscles. They're striated like cardiac muscle tissue, but they're also mostly voluntary, meaning you have to think about using them and activate them with your somatic nervous system. Most of them attach to your skeleton and create movement by pulling bones in different directions as they contract. Each one of your different skeletal muscles, like your biceps brachii or vastus lateralis or gluteus maximus, is technically its own organ made up mostly of muscle tissue, but also of connective tissue, blood vessels, and nerve fibers. And because your muscles are voracious energy hogs, each one is rigged up with its own personal nerve to stimulate contraction and its own artery and vein to keep it well fed with all the blood and oxygen and nutrients it needs to operate. So to understand those operations, we first need to get a grip on the anatomy of a skeletal muscle, which involves fibers within fibers and lots of layers. Basically, a skeletal muscle is constructed like a really sturdy piece of rope. Thousands of tiny parallel threads called myofibrils squished together to form muscle fibers, which are your actual muscle cells, cells with mitochondria, multiple nuclei, and a cellular membrane called a sarcolemma. Those muscle fibers then form larger string-like bundles called fascicles, which combine to form the larger rope-like muscle organ like your biceps brachii. Overall, this bundles of bundles configuration makes muscle tissue fairly sturdy, but considering how much abuse your muscles take when you do something like pretty simple, like lift a big bag of dog food, it's no surprise you need a little help. That's why every muscle contains a few different kinds of supportive sheaths of connective tissue, the protective reinforcements that keep that bulging muscle from bursting. So that is the structure part of the story. But if you want to get into the nitty-gritty, the down and dirty of how you actually move, well, there are rules. Really just two main rules, and they have to do with proteins. And they're both true for a lot of the proteins we talk about, whether they're enzymes or ion channels or receptors or muscle proteins. And these rules are: 1, proteins like to change shape when stuff binds to them, and 2, changing shapes can allow proteins to bind or unbind with other stuff. So keep those rules in mind while we see how a muscle fiber contracts and relaxes. Now, remember those tiny myofibrils that bundle up to form your muscle fibers? They're divided lengthwise into segments called sarcomeres, which contain 2 even tinier strands of protein, 2 different kinds of myofilaments called actin and myosin. And it's their angsty story of star-crossed love that fuels every movement your body could possibly dream of. A sarcomere contains both thin filaments made up mostly of 2 light and twisty actin strands, and thick filaments composed of thicker, lumpy-looking myosin strands. Each sarcomere is separated by what's known as a Z-line at either end, which is just a border formed by alternating thin filaments in a kind of zigzag pattern. A muscle contracting is all about sarcomeres contracting, bringing those Z-lines closer together. All right, so now comes the romance. When your muscle cells are at rest, your actin and myosin strands don't touch, but they really really want to. Specifically, that club-headed myosin wants to get all up close and personal with the actin. When this happens, and it will eventually, it's called the sliding filament model of muscle contraction. But in the meantime, like in any good love story, the pair have some obstacles to overcome. Namely, actin is blocked by a couple of protein bodyguards called tropomyosin and troponin, which keep getting in the way. Luckily, these guards can be bought off with a little ATP and some calcium. I prefer cash and nachos, but whatever. Remember, ATP is muscular current. Chemical energy, and your muscles are all about converting chemical energy to motion, so they're always hungry for more ATP. Your muscle cells have lots of nuclei, but some of them also have a lot of mitochondria, whose sole purpose in life is to crank out ATP. And muscle cells also have their own version of an endoplasmic reticulum, the cell's transport and storage system, but in this case it's specialized, so it gets a special name, the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Its walls are loaded with calcium pumps, which use ATP to save up a bunch of calcium ions. And it's also studded with calcium channels that are linked to voltage-sensitive proteins in the membrane of the muscle cell. Say I want to move my arm. My brain sends an action potential along the motor neuron until it synapses with a muscle cell in my arm. The receptors on that muscle cell are ligand-gated sodium channels. So when the motor neuron releases our old friend acetylcholine into the synapse, the channels open up and create a rush of sodium into the cell as a graded potential, which, if it's strong enough, causes nearby voltage-gated sodium channels to open. Now, I want to take a second and point out here that we're still talking about an action potential, but not in a neuron. This is happening in a muscle cell, people. So that action potential zips along a muscle cell's membrane, the sarcolemma, which has lots of tubes that run deep inside the cell called T-tubules. When the action potential travels down one of those tubes, it eventually triggers the voltage-sensitive proteins that are linked to those calcium channels in the cell's sarcoplasmic reticulum. When those channels are thrown open, the calcium stored inside rushes into the rest of the cell, and finally myosin is like, yes, here we go! At this point, the myosin is totally stoked, because the bodyguards that have been frustrating it are in for a big, irresistible distraction. That's because the protein troponin just loves to bind with calcium. And remember, when stuff binds to proteins, the proteins change shape. So the calcium latches onto the troponin and causes it to pull the other bodyguard protein, the tropomyosin, away from the sites on the actin strands that the myosin really wants to get its paws on. And suddenly it's all, okay. The only myosin heads that can bind to those newly exposed sites are the ones that are ready for action. That is, the ones that have already grabbed a molecule of ATP that's been floating around and broken it down into ADP and the leftover phosphate. When a myosin head does that, it moves into an extended position, kind of like a stretched spring, still holding on to the ADP and the phosphate, and still storing the energy that was released when they were broken apart. So after all that, with the myosin primed for action and the bodyguards out of the way, the myosin finally binds to actin, and it is beautiful. When they bind, the myosin releases all that stored energy, and in the excitement of it all, the myosin changes shape. It pulls on its precious actin strand, kind of like pulling a rope hand over fist. In the process, it shrinks the whole sarcomere and contracts the muscle. That's the sliding part of the sliding filament model. Now, with its energy spent, that little head has no use for the ADP and the phosphate, so they unbind with it because, remember rule number 2, changing shape encourages proteins to bind or unbind with stuff. That unbinding causes a small change in its shape, which lets a fresh ATP bind there in its place. That binding causes another shape change, but this time it causes the myosin to release from the actin in a tear-jerking scene like some microscopic recreation of the finale from Titanic. But fear not, this epic is not quite over, because this is when the myosin breaks down its new molecule of ATP into ADP and a phosphate, which moves it into the armed position yet again, getting it ready for its next rendezvous. And meanwhile, those calcium pumps are working hard to restock the calcium in the sarcoplasmic reticulum, so they start grabbing the calcium that's floating around, causing calcium to unbind from the troponin. When it unbinds, the resulting shape change puts the tropomyosin bodyguards back into place. It's a circle, or potentially a big Hollywood franchise with lots and lots of sequels. It keeps repeating itself many, many times every moment while I sit here and talk, and while you sit there and eat and text and take notes, the whole drama replaying itself over and over. Kind of like you'll have to play this video over and over again to get all the little steps of the sliding filament model straightened out. But hey, some stories get better the more you hear them. If you do.
All right. So we'll link that. I'll put that up in the link today when we get onto Canvas. You guys will find that. I'll put that at the very, very bottom under like the resources section. Okay, so that kind of, now that you kind of knew who the players were, right? We went over like what the structures are. We have actin, we had myosin, troponin, and tropomyosin, right? That area where they are all bound to each other is called the sarcomere, and it's the area between two sections, right? Like two Z lines, right? And when those Z lines move closer together, that's what we're going to spend the rest of our time talking about. So that is the sliding filament model, or the sliding filament theory if you were in school when I was in school. So like basically that's how we look at that. By the way, if you want to see one of the coolest stories ever, sliding filament theory Huxtable. This is one of my favorite weird little stories. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about this. Or no, not Huxtable, Huxley. That's what I'm looking for. So let's see here, origin. Yeah, so check this out. So this is very weird, but there were, when they first discovered, like when we were first discovering this, right? We didn't have very good microscopes back in the day. And there were these two groups of scientists who were both kind of studying muscles at the same time. One of them was this guy, Andrew Huxley, and this other guy, Rolf Niedergerk. And they were studying it. Meanwhile, another group named Hugh Huxley and Gene Hansen were also studying this. These two groups of scientists were studying the same thing, and they didn't know it. One was in England and one was in America. Like they were in two totally different places. There was no internet, so it wasn't like they knew of each other's research at the same time. And they both discovered the sliding filament model, right? They both kind of saw these specialized little proteins. And then both of them, because this is what scientists do, published their work, and they both published it in the same magazine, the same Journal of Medicine, at the same time. And if that's not like the Matrix glitching out, I don't know what is. Like, you know, if this isn't all a simulation, if that doesn't prove that this is all just a simulation, I don't know what does. Wow. I don't actually believe that, but I do think that that's a crazy, like, fun little thing. That's like one of my favorite little stories. So if you ever want to read about that, look it up. Okay, so let's see here. That's our contractile proteins. Okay, so now let's go ahead and really quickly look at like neural activation. Like if we're talking about neural activation, this is how we use the term neuromuscular a lot, right? Like that means that our nervous system is working with our muscular system. It's the neuromuscular system, right? Like my brain controls my muscles, but my muscles have these little proteins. So if those proteins aren't being activated the way they're supposed to, if they're already in an activated position, I'm not going to be able to use my muscle the way that my brain thinks it will be able to use that muscle. That'll cause my brain to compensate, and then it will learn, how to use that muscle improperly. And that's really a lot of what we're talking about when we talk about like overactive versus underactive muscles here. So we're going to go through this. This is not super relevant to this course. I mean, like we always review this stuff. We always do a lot of like the sliding filament model and like neural activation and stuff. It's not like a big chunk of the assessment side of things, but this will come back in our next mod, which is like where we start diving into like the physiology. This is where we really get deep into this stuff. So let's go ahead and look at it. And then like, if you have questions, I can answer those questions maybe after class. We're not gonna spend too much time on it in the lecture proper. But let's go ahead and look at neural activation here. Neural, underline, so neural activation and the sliding filament model, right? Okay, so we got to kind of look at like how every muscular contraction works. So we know that neural activation is really important in order for us to like, communicate our nervous system, be able to communicate with our muscular system, right? This is what allows it to happen. So we have these things that we call motor units, right? So a motor unit is a single motor neuron, right? And remember, motor neurons are those neurons that are traveling away from the brain in order to communicate and do work. Whew, bless me. Good Lord. So it's a motor unit is a single motor neuron, and all of the individual muscle fibers that it innervates, or you can think of it as stimulates, right? So when you look at a motor unit, right, you can see, that's actually a pretty good picture right there. You can see like there's the tail end, that's the axon of a neuron, and then it branches off, and you'll notice it's like it's touching this muscle fiber over here, and that muscle fiber over there, and that muscle fiber over there, right? It's going to innervate each of those little individual muscle fibers and cause them to contract. So if you've got like, let's say 10 muscle cells contracting, that's going to be a pretty weak contraction. But if you've got 10,000 muscle cells contracting, that's going to be a really, really large contraction. So you've got small motor units for really fine movements, right? Like really like the movements of your eye. Those are controlled by motor units, right? You can move your eyes up and down and side to side. Those are controlled by motor units, but they're controlled by like little tiny ones. Really large motor units, like your glutes, like controlling like to do like a heavy barbell squat or a deadlift, that's a really large motor unit that consists of like thousands and thousands of motor units, right? So, we are going to see a kind of a big difference here in how we recruit those. Your body's going to always try to prioritize and get the movement done with as little motor unit development as possible. Like it'll try to recruit as few motor units as it can. So what it'll do is it'll start with the relatively small motor units, then it'll recruit some larger ones if it can't get the job done, then it'll recruit some larger ones if it can't get the job done, until eventually it's recruiting like your largest motor units in order to lift that heavy weight, okay? So that's kind of neural activation in a nutshell, right? And the way this works, right, is this triggers the sliding action in your muscle cells, right? So, so neural activation triggers the sliding action in the sliding filament model, right? So let's go ahead and look at what that looks like, right? So the sliding filament theory is how these contractile proteins actually slide and move, right? So a sarcomere, right, that area between two Z lines is going to shorten because neural activation will activate the sliding filament theory, right? So those two Z lines are going to pull closer together. Now, this right here is going to describe the entire process. And I know it's like a really, really big list. So I'm just going to, we kind of saw it in the video here, but I'm going to kind of break this down a little bit slowly. But a nerve impulse, right, that's an action potential. Your neuron starts generating electricity, is transmitted through a neuron, and it's going to travel down the tail of the neuron, that's called the axon, and it will synapse with a muscle fiber, right? We call that area the neuromuscular junction. So where that synapse actually happens. Now, what's going to happen is at the very end of that tail, acetylcholine is, oh, that's not what I want to look up, actually. Yeah, that's fine. It worked. You're going to see this little synapse right here. This is called the neuromuscular junction. It is where you can see this little, this kind of dome-shaped thing. That's the tail end of a neuron. And then here, this little binding site, this little gap here, that is the neuromuscular junction. And this is a muscle cell down here. So it's where the neuron is meeting the muscle cell, right? There's a little gap, it kind of sits into it like that. And what happens is it releases this neurotransmitter called acetylcholine, right? So what it'll do, when that electricity travels down, that action potential reaches down, acetylcholine is going to diffuse across this little gap here, and it'll bind to these specialized little like receptor sites. Now, when that happens, once that binding site is filled, that triggers your muscle to generate its own action potential, right? So acetylcholine will bind to a receptor on the muscle fiber, right? So electricity travels down, that releases acetylcholine. That acetylcholine binds to a receptor on the muscle fiber. Now that continues an action potential in the muscle fiber. So now the muscle fiber starts generating electricity, and it zaps around the entire fiber of the muscle. And when that happens, that electricity running throughout, and remember earlier we were talking about the sarcoplasmic reticulum, right? So that electricity travels along the sarcoplasmic reticulum, releasing calcium into that area of town where actin and myosin are living, right? That's sarcomere. So it releases calcium into the sarcoplasm where your sarcomeres are going to be located, right? That calcium is what troponin is attracted to, right? That troponin and tropomyosin, they're attracted to calcium. So what's going to happen is once calcium's flushed in, the chaperones that keep actin and myosin from binding together, troponin and tropomyosin, they're going to move away. They're going to like, all right, well, you two don't try anything. I'm going to go see what's up with calcium over here. You know, like, and so they move away. And obviously, because actin and myosin are star-crossed lovers, they're not going to listen to those chaperones and they're going to bind together. So they're going to move out of the way thanks to calcium being flushed into our muscle cell, right? Now, myosin is going to attach to the actin, and what that's going to do is that's going to cause the sliding part of the sliding filament model. The troponin and myosin over there, they're going to move this way. Troponin and myosin that are over there, they're going to move this way. And my Z line, my sarcomere, is going to shorten, right? Then once that impulse subsides, calcium is going to be flushed out of the area. That's going to bring those chaperones back in, and those binding sites are going to be blocked again, and myosin's going to let go of its precious actin and go back into a resting position. And that is how we have muscle contractions. Anybody have any questions about that?
What happens with the residual ATP again? Or
it got burnt up. So what'll happen? Yeah. So what'll happen? What gives the myosin energy to like reach up and grab is like an ATP molecule. So what's weird about it though is that like when it binds, what'll happen is the ATP will break off one of its phosphate. It'll capture a whole bunch of that energy that's released, right? That's how ATP works, right? It breaks that third phosphate off. Tons of energy is released. It captures that energy. Now, because that ATP molecule changed shape, you know, it can burn up that energy and move into, you know, and actually stroke and like shorten the muscle. Then what'll happen is it will release the ADP molecule and a new ATP molecule will bind to it. When that new ATP molecule binds to it, it lets go and that flushes the calcium out. Then it goes back into a resting position, breaks the energy, and is able to move again. So it's kind of that's actually what's kind of weird when you think about it, is you're like, oh, so it's like when the energy is released, that's what causes like the stroke and stuff. But it's actually like the binding of burnt up ATP, like ADP, that actually allows like the shape change to take place. So it's actually like when a new molecule comes in and binds before it actually breaks itself off. So this is why this is like kind of a continuous process, right? Like this is something that really is constantly happening, right? You may not be using like, you know, like your muscle may just be sitting around right now. If your arms are at your sides like mine, like my biceps really aren't doing anything right now, but they've got ATP like ready to they're like, it's time to break. And it's like, break. And it's like, yeah, it's always like ready for it, right? And then like the next molecule comes in. So eventually, that's actually part of the reason why we get tired. That's why we can't just continually, you know, when we're lifting really, really heavy, that's super lactic acid, that very acidic environment actually makes it really difficult to bind all of this stuff and allow all of this stuff to do its job. That's a big part of us getting tired and exhausted, you know, and why resting like gives us more energy. It's not only about ATP production, it's also about like ATP's ability to actually bind. By the way, I did forget one thing that I should mention, just because I've seen the question like 100,000 million times. It doesn't change any of our definition, but I always forget that NASM likes to use this one definition here. Up here at sarcomere, if you want to like, if you're taking notes at home, put this in your notes, circle it, underline it, highlight it. NASM loves this sentence, but the sarcomere is the functional unit of the muscular system. I totally forgot to mention that, and I always try to mention that. Remember, the sarcomere is the area where actin and myosin, like where they're shortening together. If you didn't have that area of your muscle fiber cells, you wouldn't have the specialized ability to like contract. So because of that, that makes it the functional unit. Just like a neuron is the functional unit of the nervous system, a sarcomere is the functional unit of the muscular system. They love to say that. They love that question. So I just want to make sure we get that sentence down. All right, so is everybody feeling pretty good about the sliding filament stuff? You feel like we need any more time on it? I feel like I was really muddled in the beginning of this. I'm trying to like focus in. I like chugged that coffee during during that video. I was like, I'm gonna get through this coffee so that I focus up. All right, let's go ahead and look at our muscle fiber type. So let's zoom out, right? Let's back away and look at the more like training functional side of things, right? So our muscle fiber types, we got, you know, obviously all muscle is made up of individual muscle cells, but they have different characteristics. They look different. Again, function following form, right? So our muscle fiber types, I'm going to give this a definition this time just for the sake of it. Muscle, underline, muscle fiber types, right? Muscles are going to have different characteristics that allow them to have different strength, energy, and visual differences. Good Lord, that's the word I'm looking for. Related to how they operate. Whew, boy. All right, so your muscles are going to have different characteristics, right? Like they're going to look different, right? If you have like a really large muscle, you know, like a large number of muscle fibers, like you just have a whole bunch of fibers and those fibers are really, really large, because you have like more cells and larger cells, you are going to have more fluid, right? Like you know, just like a person who weighs more, right, is going to have more like body than somebody who weighs less. If you weigh more, it's going to take more energy to run your body, right? It's going to take more liquid to fuel your body. It's going to take more everything. You need more water every day. You need more everything. And so like that is similar on like a smaller level when we look at our muscles. If you have really, really large muscles, you have more fluid within those muscles. And so like that means that they're really good at doing the energy production stuff related to like in the fluid energy production. Now, if you have really small muscles, but you need to be able to like do lots of work, well, then your muscle is not really experiencing like growth, but it is still producing like energy. So it's going to find a different way to produce that energy. It's going to do it with the use of like oxygen and things like that, right? And this is sort of where we get into talking a little bit about like energy production, but you know, you've got two types of metabolism. You've got your aerobic metabolism and your anaerobic metabolism. Your anaerobic metabolism takes place in the absence of oxygen. It actually gets produced in the liquid portions of your cells. So if you have more cells with more liquid, you're going to be really good at that anaerobic metabolism. And your anaerobic metabolism is the stuff that's really good at producing like little bits of ATP, but it's able to produce it super, 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 super fast. So you can think of it as like kind of like your nitrous. It's like your booster that gives you like a whole bunch of big bursts of energy. But because it's not producing very much energy like in one big go, right? It's producing little bits very fast. It tends to get exhausted and can't really keep up as easily. So what ends up happening is you get this big burst of energy and then you get exhausted, right? Like we're able to lift something really heavy one time and then we got to throw that barbell down and rest for 5 minutes, right? So that's very much an anaerobic style of energy production. Your aerobic style of energy production actually doesn't produce ATP very often, but it produces a whole bunch of it whenever it produces. So it's almost like if you think of like anaerobic as like little tiny ones producing a whole bunch, like, you know, very, very quickly. And then you can think of like aerobic energy production as like way, like a bunch gets created, but kind of slowly, right? And that's really good for like your aerobic stuff, right? Like you may not be able to create like a big strong contraction, but you can create contractions pretty much forever as long as you have enough like fuel. Which, considering that there's a whole bunch of oxygen on this planet, you pretty much have an unlimited fuel source. So that's kind of the difference between aerobic versus anaerobic in terms of energy production. So when we look at the characteristics, like if I were to cut out some of your muscle cells, right, and look at like the differences between them, if I pull out like some of the muscle cells from like your glutes, which are these big, heavy duty muscles, and then I pulled out like a muscle cell from like, I don't know, let's say like your jaw, right? Like there's a muscle that we can kind of use all day. You know, they're going to look different. One's going to be much larger in size, and it's going to have a whole bunch of like sarcoplasm, which means it's really good at that heavy duty strength, anaerobic metabolism. And then if I looked at the muscles in your jaw, I'm going to see lots of little tiny mitochondria. They're going to be a little smaller in size. There's not going to be as much fluid, which means they're much better at producing energy on the go. And you can, you know, your genetics are going to influence like what type of muscle you are sort of gifted at developing, right? Like I'm not a huge fan of the whole thing. Like a lot of people love to like break down like, hey, I'm an ectomorph. I tend to be really skinny naturally. And somebody else like, well, I'm a mesomorph. I tend to be really muscular really easily. I don't really put too much stock in that. I think that that's a pretty soft science. Because we do know that like the body adapts to whatever stress you place upon it. I think that it's much less related to just like you being cursed to be a skinny person, or, you know, being cursed to be an overweight person your whole life. I think it's much less related to that. I think that there's more likely other factors at play. Like, yeah, you may be gifted in a certain type of like metabolism because like that's the style that you grew up, but I think that's probably more related to like family habits and stuff, you know? Like I tend to be a very lanky, skinny, aerobic metabolism person. You know, my dad's a furniture mover, and I grew up lifting furniture like in my formative athletic years. Like I started when I was like 15, and like 8 hours of lifting heavy objects back and forth all day. You know, like that's a very aerobic thing. You know, like walking up a walkboard, walking back into the house, getting more body, like do. And so like, you know, and even as a kid, I used to like walk around my dad and help him like when I was moving. And my parents are walkers, you know, like my parents will, you know, if something is super, like if it's a block away, we're not going to drive, we're going to walk. Some people, a little bit different, right? Like some people are going to be like, you know what, that's a little bit of a trick. Let's just take the car over there, we could use it, right? So like that is like a habit thing. You know, you grew up in your family affects your habits, right? More so, I think, than like your genes just saying it's like, you're skinny, you're cursed to be skinny. You're overweight, you're cursed to be overweight. I think that there's a lot more likely like psychological, structural things in your life. Your life is designed to give you the shape that you have, right? And I find that in the gym. I would have a much easier time gaining muscle if my idea of working out wasn't blood, sweat, and tears. Like to me, a workout should be like, I should be walking out of the gym just like this every time. Like that's how I feel. But like hypertrophy training is really like intense while you're lifting with also very structured rest. You should be taking plenty of rest so you can work harder. I hate resting. It's not in my brain. Is that my metabolism or is that like my habits? And obviously some of your clients are going to be different as well, you know? They're going to have like similar conversations with them. They're going to be like, oh, I heard like, you know, this develops, you know, I'm only going to develop type 1 muscle. It's like, no, it's just you're going to develop like whatever type of stress you put on the body, that's going to result in whatever you develop. If you want to have more fast twitch muscle fibers, you need to lift heavy and take long rest periods. And you need to show up and do it, you know? So our muscle fiber types, we've got type 1 fibers, which are called your slow twitch fibers, okay? Now, your slow twitch fibers tend to be smaller in size their defining characteristics. They are smaller in size. They produce less force, but they are associated with stabilization and endurance type exercises. And they also have increased oxygen delivery, and therefore and more mitochondria. So mitochondria, that's where you are producing energy with aerobic metabolism. They have less size, therefore they have less fluid than your anaerobic or type 2 type fibers, right? So then we've got our type 2 fibers. These are your fast twitch fibers, okay? So type 2, whoa, no. These are your fast twitch fibers, okay? These tend to be larger in size, produce more force. They are associated with force and power type contractions. Actually, we'll say max strength and power type contractions. They are usually quick to fatigue. Actually, I should put that up here. Hold on. Slow to fatigue in your type 1 fibers. Type 2 fibers are quick to fatigue. And they have more cytoplasm and less mitochondria, right? So they have more fluid. They are better at that anaerobic metabolism. Now, before we move on, I want to address there are actually there's kind of two subtypes here. That's type 2 as a category. You are going to have type 2A, which is going to be your, actually, let me see here if I can find a good picture of this. Type 2 muscle fibers, 2A, 2X. I'm probably not going to find the chart I want. I don't know how to Google it. And I don't have a picture in my PowerPoints. All right, well, here's kind of a cool little chart here. So you are going to have type 2A and type 2X. This chart here will kind of help us. I was hoping to get a picture, but if you think of like 2A and 2X, these are both fast twitch. They're both like used for strong, powerful contractions. But your 2X have a low oxidative capacity and your type 2A have a high oxidative capacity. So what we mean by that is like there's very little oxygen being delivered in the 2X. They are very anaerobic. Your type 2A is almost like a stopgap between these two, right? Type 2A is fast twitch, but it also does get a somewhat high delivery of oxygen, like definitely not as much oxygen delivery as your type 1, but still like some. And so they tend to exhaust a little bit more slowly than your type 2X. So your type 2A are going to be your high oxidative fast twitch fibers. And your type 2X is going to be your low oxidative fast twitch fibers. That is the true fast twitch, right? That is the true super explosive fast twitch. So let's look at like athletes here, right? Let's look at 3 different types of athletes. If we think of like a marathoner, right? That's somebody who needs to be doing their sport for multiple hours, right? Non-stop. Like they aren't going through like periods of like some rest. Like they are literally, you know, using their muscles just as much from start to finish for many hours, right? That's a type 1 athlete. And then let's look at like another type of runner. Let's look at like a a soccer player, right? Like a soccer player or a football player, both of those are going to go through like periods of like high intensity and low intensity. Like a soccer player is going to be jogging around the whole game, but then there's going to be a moment where they're going to recruit some more muscle fibers, do a big sprint, get that ball around, kick it, and then like they're going to go back to that kind of slow jog, right? That right there means that like you need to have some endurance, but you also need to have the ability to have this big burst of energy, right? That's very much like a type 2A athlete, right? Most sports that you're thinking of, like most athletes are very type 2A. Football, right? You need to be able to have like a big burst of energy, but then you got to get back to the line and do the next play, right? So that is type 2A. That's actually very commonly associated with like strength endurance and hypertrophy training, right? Little bit of duration, but also like still very high intensity. Then you have like an Olympic sprinter, right? Like somebody who is literally working for less than 10 seconds, right? But they are working faster than any human being on the planet, right? It's literally the fastest people we have, at least for 10 seconds, right? Like this super big, bam, like burst of energy. You can also think of like an Olympic power lifter, right? Or not an Olympic power, an Olympic weightlifter, right? Like somebody who's going to go up, they've got a whole bunch of weight on the ground, and they're going to pull it one time, and then they're going to drop it. And it's like, all right, I competed in my sport. It took me 10 seconds. Goodbye. You know, like done and done. That is type 2X athletes. Like an Olympic sprinter is a type 2X. So like, you know, if you think of like the way that these muscle fibers are going to look, there's going to be the most mitochondria and the smallest size in a marathoner. There will be a medium amount of mitochondria and a medium size in like sort of our traditional like team sport athletes. And then in Olympic like Olympic weightlifters or Olympic sprinters, you're going to see very large size with like very low oxidative capacity. They're going to be able to work really hard briefly. And then they recover and they're able to work really hard again, you know? So that's kind of what we're going to look at there in terms of like our metabolic like types of muscles, right? Type 1 versus type 2. All right, so then any questions on that, by the way? Comments, concerns?
Yeah, actually, I do have a question there.
Totally.
Real quick, because I actually got a phone call and I got disconnected, but I don't know if you covered this already. Just want to know, does type 1 have that category? Because I know that we mentioned this last time that 70% or 50% of your max, 1 rep max, right? Mm-hmm. Is that considered 2 categories there?
So,
like type X?
Oh my gosh, there's a train outside.
Yeah, I know.
That's hilarious. No, yeah, so it is somewhat related to your 1 rep max. But here's the dirty secret about 1 rep maxes. You know, the reason we have a 1 rep max is because what's actually important when it comes to like metabolism is the duration, right? Like what I'm describing here is like long duration, medium duration, short duration, right? Now we know that you have to work as hard as possible in order to trigger growth, right? Your body, the principle of progressive overload, right? Your body has to work at intensities higher than it is used to in order to feel the need to adapt and grow. So you want to develop endurance, you need to be able to work for a long time. Can you work a long time if you are lifting at a high percentage of your 1 rep max? No, right? No. So the reason we have intensities is because they help us determine our duration, right? Just like if you're trying to develop like, you know, like very large muscles, right? Like say you want to develop a lot of like type 2 muscle fibers, you need to lift at a high intensity because that will result in a short duration. So you'll use your anaerobic metabolism, and then just before you kick into the aerobic metabolism, you're going to stop and rest and kind of reset that timer. Then you're going to go right to the edge again, and then you're going to reset that timer. So you got 2 principles at work here. You've got like 1, which is triggering your body to feel the need to grow. And you've got 1, which is literally using your metabolism in a way that your body is going to want to adapt to that type of energy stress, right?
Right.
So there is the nervous system side of it, and there's the energy production side of it. And both of those are sort of met when we follow our, when we follow our rules of physiology. Like, when I do like my sets and reps the way I'm supposed to, right? Like I could, like, what if I just did, what if I kept my duration short? I go to the gym and I do 5 reps, but that 5 reps is at like 10% of my 1 rep max, right? A very, very low weight.
Yeah.
I stayed in my anaerobic metabolism. So what's funny is like my body will adapt to that short duration, but it will not feel the need to trigger any more muscle growth because I didn't challenge my body. So my nervous system didn't go, that was hard. It was like, that was easy. So I'm gonna
So
so if I'm not pushing myself.
with that method you described, this last method you just described, can that be used as a maintenance for muscles? Or
Oh, sure, yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's kind of what we're all experiencing right now. If you don't have like a lot of intense equipment, like I don't have access to anything all that heavy right now. Am I expecting to see like a lot of muscular growth in this time? Not really. Like I'm finding ways to make things heavier and harder. Like I mentioned this morning, I'm doing like those archer push-ups, and I can make the archer push-up harder by moving my arm more out to the side. The further I go out to the side, the more difficult the exercise is. But like, is that because the weight's heavier, right? Am I putting a greater I weigh the same amount no matter what the angle is. Now, if I take my legs up onto like my bed, that's putting a greater distribution on smaller muscles because I've changed the angle. So yeah, that is more weight on a smaller muscle. So now I'm like triggering like the anaerobic stuff in my shoulders, but I just made it harder with like stability for my chest. So is my chest going to grow? Maybe not, it'll get stronger. Like my nervous system will adapt to the movement and it'll learn how to do the movement, but will it trigger muscular growth? It's debatable. And that's why I like body weight stuff is kind of tough. However, that work, just a little bit of work has been enough to like help us maintain our muscle. It will trigger like, a sustaining effect, and that'll get us all back to the gym eventually.
Definitely. Now, just to clarify though, just so I understand you answered the question, so I want to make sure I didn't miss anything. Type 1 doesn't have that subcategory like 2 does.
Nope. I mean, you can if you want to think of it, you can think of 2A as like half type 1, half type 2X,
Oh, okay.
Kind of in the middle, if you want to think of it that way. But no, you've got type 1 and you've got type 2. Type 2 is divided into 2A and 2X.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. All right, so now looking at muscles as movers. So this is going to be describing our agonists, antagonists, right? So if we know that like muscles can only shorten, right, and relax, they can only pull, we have to be able to pull in both directions, right? So because of that, we label them, depending on whether or not they are pulling or whether they're relaxing. We love to get things when we're labeling them down to like 2s, right? This way or that way, not a third way. So agonists are a muscle that is acting as a prime mover, right? So this is the muscle that's doing most of the work, right? A prime mover. My favorite way to describe this is like it's the Batman, right? It's the Batman of the story. It's the main muscle doing the job. So your gluteus maximus, for example, glute max is the prime mover for hip extension, okay? Then we got antagonists, which are exactly the opposite of agonists, right? So an antagonist is going to be a muscle that is acting opposite a prime mover, right? My tricep is the antagonist to my bicep, right? And so if my glute max does hip extension, my hip flexors do hip flexion, right? So my my hip flexor complex is the antagonist for hip extension, right? Because it does hip flexion. Then we got synergists, which are going to help, right? So synergists are going to be a muscle that assists a prime mover. So this is going to be a muscle that is helping your prime mover. So, my hamstring complex assists with hip extension, right? So the hamstring complex assists in hip extension. They're not great at it, right? They're not really the best hip extensors. That's what you've got your glute for. Now, there are times where that synergist takes over. We actually call that synergistic dominance. And that inhibits your prime mover from being able to move the way it's supposed to, leading to bad form and the overdevelopment of certain muscles, which leads to altered joint mechanics. So obviously something we don't want to experience. And then lastly, you've got stabilizers. And these are muscles that stabilize the body during functional movements, right? The core, the rotator cuff, etc., right? These are muscles that are there to make sure that your body moves in a direction it's supposed to. So by developing, a lot of times what most people do is they go to the gym and they work on prime movers like crazy. They go and they mainly focus on those big compound lifts and vanity muscles and things like that. And that's really good for strengthening those muscles, but does it make you athletic? Well, that's up for debate, right? Because now you've strengthened in one direction, but if you didn't take time to balance that out in the other direction, your antagonist, when it's its turn to act as an agonist, might not be able to, right? If I spend all my time developing my chest and I don't do anything for my upper back, when this muscle is an agonist, yeah, it's really strong. But when this muscle is an agonist, right, my upper back, because this is so used to contracting, I'm actually going to lose strength pulling in the opposite direction. So that is what we call altered reciprocal inhibition. Then, if I can't pull the way I'm supposed to, a synergist muscle is going to step in and try and do the work of that weak agonist. That's what we call synergistic dominance, right? And so that's going to cause me to move another way because that synergist is not really like let's say I have weak glutes and my hamstrings try to do all my hip extension. I'm probably also going to be bending my knee more than I need to, and that could be putting too much stress on how my on certain joints. So synergistic dominance, not something we want to experience either. Or if I have weak stabilizers, my body's not going to be able to hold itself in place. Doing something like a chest press could hurt my spine. It's not really supposed to do any work, but if I'm not able to contract my core properly, I'm going to move, or I might, not be able to stabilize, and then I, twist my arm and tear my rotator cuff. So that's what we got. You think of an agonist as like Batman, right? It's the main character of the show. Then you've got antagonists like the Joker, which do the exact opposite of Batman. You got synergists like Robin, who are there to assist Batman. And you got stabilizers, which are there to kind of keep the whole thing in check. That's like Alfred, the butler. All right. Any questions, comments, concerns on that stuff? I know we already went over that last mod. I know you guys are all familiar, but figured I would ask. All righty. So last little bit here, we're just going to blast through our endocrine system. So your endocrine system, this is your hormone system, right? This is a series of glands and hormones and things like that that have really cool effects on the body, right? You usually have some type of host organ that holds a gland, and then that gland is able to excrete some type of hormone, and that hormone is part of your nervous system, right? If you think of your nervous system as controlling your body, your hormones also control your body. They have effects on body tissues. Your nervous system does it by zapping your body, right? Your nervous system's zap, and then your muscle goes, "Wah," and then it contracts, right? But if you run certain hormones throughout your muscles, things like adrenaline, that actually triggers action potentials as well. It actually gets the body ready to more effectively, generate that electric charge. And so your hormones are really important here because they are also part of regulating certain body conditions, right? So you can see here, you've got your main gland when it comes to your endocrine system, which is going to be your pituitary gland. We call that the master gland. And that is where, that is what triggers other hormones to get created. This is what's kind of weird about hormones. Hormones kind of work on like a game of telephone, right? Like where it's like you say something to one person and that person says something to another person and that person says something to another person. A lot of times you have hormones that trigger the production of other hormones. And so like your pituitary gland, for instance, triggers the release of certain hormones that go throughout your body. That triggers the release of those other hormones, right? So growth hormone, testosterone, estrogen, things like that. So your pituitary gland has these different lobes on them. One of the things that it makes is what's called TSH. That's thyroid stimulating hormone. And so thyroid stimulating hormone triggers your thyroid to produce growth hormone, right? And then you've got things like your adrenal glands, right? They're going to produce, so your pituitary gland is going to produce a gland that is going to stimulate the production of your adrenaline. And so that gland creates like a little hormone. It runs through your blood. Eventually it runs past your kidneys. And that's where like your adrenaline is actually created. These little lobes that sit on top of your kidneys. And so it goes, oh, hey, we got some of that hormone. That must mean we're supposed to produce some adrenaline. Boom. And then it happens, right? So there's a lot of like interesting hormones that get created in the pituitary gland to trigger the release of other hormones. So your thyroid is really important because that's actually going to regulate your metabolism. When we think of like our metabolism, remember, it's all chemical reactions that are taking place in the body. So if you want to speed up and have lots of chemical reactions, you're going to create more thyroid stimulating hormone. If you want to have less chemical reactions, you're going to produce less thyroid stimulating hormone. You've got your adrenaline glands, which are responsible for things like inflammation in the body, but they also produce things like epinephrine, which is adrenaline. And so like that is going to give you a whole big boost of energy when you need it to go to the gym or get amped up when you're in traffic. You've got your adrenal and testes, which are going to produce things like testosterone. For both sexes, by the way, like women produce testosterone as well. That's a very anabolic hormone that triggers the production of muscle cells. So like when you hear somebody taking steroids, they are basically injecting testosterone. And so that triggers the anabolic process of generating more muscle tissue. It's also why men tend to have an easier time generating like, larger anaerobic muscles because of our elevated levels of testosterone. One of the most important ones that we talk about is going to be glucose control, right? That is going to be regulated by two hormones called insulin and glucagon. Insulin's job is to drive sugar out of your blood into either a cell to produce energy or a cell to be stored as glycogen or to be converted into fat and then be stored in an adipocyte or fat cell. Right? So you're either going to store that sugar or you're going to use that sugar, and insulin's going to trigger that to happen. Meanwhile, you've also got glucagon, and glucagon's going to do the exact opposite. That's going to pull that sugar either out of your glycogen, that's going to pull it out of your glycogen stores in order to be used for energy production. And so glucagon actually raises your blood sugar levels. Insulin lowers your blood sugar levels. And exercise is going to improve the utilization of both of those. Epinephrine, again, that's your fight or flight hormone, that's your adrenaline. So obviously we have hormones that are produced by both men and women, right? Men are going to produce a lot more testosterone. Women are going to produce a little bit more estrogen. Cortisol is another one that we both generate. Cortisol is a stress hormone that is part of like your adrenal glands. This is the one that we're always trying to avoid. Like, don't get me wrong, cortisol is actually a good thing. That's a controversial sentence because everybody's like, no, we're always trying to avoid cortisol production. Like, yeah, we need cortisol. Cortisol is like a stress hormone that makes us be stressed. Like if you didn't have stress in your life, you'd be like, well, I could eat. but who cares? You know, and then you would start it up. Like, I could pay my bills or I could just be homeless. You know, like we need stress to keep us moving, right? The problem is we're still like a biologic creature that is supposed to be like, you know, fighting wolves and bears and lions and tigers. And we don't really live in that world anymore. So we have cortisol to like fight off those things and deal with that stress. But our body doesn't know that paying your bills on time is not the same as fighting a bear. And so you're like, oh my God, that's due today. And then all of a sudden you produce a whole bunch of cortisol because you're stressed out. You know, that's kind of the world we live in now. So yeah, we're producing cortisol all day long, right? You get cut off in traffic, you're fighting a bear, you know? So we produce a lot of cortisol. We want to manage our cortisol levels. We live in a world where we're producing way too much of it. So we are trying to avoid cortisol production as often as possible. Yep, and that's about it when it comes to hormones and stuff. So muscular system, a lot of individual fibers all held together to attach to your bones and then move those bones around. And they're going to generate that force through the sliding filament theory. You have agonists, which are the main muscles, antagonists, which are opposite of the main muscles, synergists, which help your main muscles, and stabilizers, which are there to kind of hold the whole body in place. Any questions or comments or concerns on what we got today? Hey guys,
Oh, sir.
we good? Deborah, did you say
I said no.
Oh, okay. I saw your thing light up, but I didn't hear anything.
Also, it lights up when we talk.
It does, yeah. It has like a little, your square brightens.
Oh, that's cool.
That's how, like, that's why sometimes, like, if you guys notice, I'll go, and, like, it'll just be somebody like touching their phone. That's not me hearing voices. All right. So we got homework number 1 going out today. You're going to notice it'll all be related to the kinetic chain. So this will actually kind of feel like homework 1 and 2 of kinesiology, or maybe just homework 1. But it'll kind of feel similar to that, but you'll get a kind of a variety of questions that are slightly different. So we'll go ahead and end the recording. See y'all tomorrow.